So it seems that last year in December when Joe Biden was saying this,
the United States is all in on Africa's future.
he was not joking. Hey guys, welcome back for a new video of China in the Global South project. If it's your first time on this channel, I'd like you to click on that subscribe button and ring bell so you are up to date in every time we drop a video about China in the Global South. My name is Christian Géraud. I'm the Francophone editor of the China Global South project, and today I'm going to take you in a journey about China, US, Africa relationship and the new dynamic that's taking place since last year. For those of you who've been following the news, you're kind of aware of the new dynamic that's happening in the world right now, where we see the US on one side and China on one side, and now more and more people are talking about the new Cold War that are taking place in the world right now. So in the midst of that Cold War, we have many players that are taking to take side, and of course, we have Africa as usual. And now the question is Africa going to lean toward China or leaning toward the US and the West? And we know for many months now, there have been worries from people in Washington or in Europe, in London, in Paris, in Brussels, about China influence in Africa. And over the years, they kind of build a narrative about China, I would say the China bashing narrative in Africa, how China is dangerous for African country, how China is not really a reliable partner in Africa. So when we see American President Joe Biden saying, US is all in Africa, we kind of expect that now the US is coming into the fold, that is coming and trying to challenge China's position in Africa. Since January this year, we've had 5 high US officials visiting 10 African countries. I'd like you to take a look on the list and you're gonna see how many African countries have been visited. We have 10 African countries and some of them have been visited twice. We had the case of Ghana, Kenya, or Zambia. And Zambia, of course, with the debt crisis happening right now and the tension between the US and China over China's demand of debt restructuring of Zambia government, it's quite normal to see a lot of tension happening in Zambia. So the last US official to be in visit in Africa was Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States. Last week, she was on a tour in Africa where she visited 3 African countries. She went to Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia. And of course, during a trip, China came out quite a lot. And, you know, the response she got from African leaders about China's position was quite frank and straightforward by saying that we are not into the business of choosing side, of picking side in that situation. For that, I would like you to take a listen on what Nana Akufo-Addo, Ghanaian president, had to say when they asked him about China presence in Africa.
No, there may be an obsession in America about the Chinese activities on the continent, but there's no such obsession here. About China is one of the many countries with whom Ghana is engaged in the world. Your country is one of them. Virtually all the countries of the world are friends of Ghana, and we have relations in varying degrees of intensity with all of them.
So, as you can hear him, as he said, there is no obsession about China issue in Africa or even in Ghana, despite what everybody can say, despite what the Western media or any Western political decision maker can say. You can feel it, you can see how much African leaders are not faced by the China, what I call the China bashing narrative when it comes to China presence in Africa. And they're quite clear about what they want when they say that, you know, we are not here, there's no obsession, there's no worriness about China engagement in Africa. Ghana is friend to many countries, Ghana is friend to China, is friend to the US, is friend to any other country in the world. And there's no context where China presence in Ghana can be interpreted and seen as a threat to any kind of power in Africa. And that was the same narrative that Kamala Harris had to hear when she was in Zambia. In Zambia, where the debt issue is quite serious because China is posing conditions to the IMF and the World Bank that's kind of blocking debt restructuring in Zambia. But despite that, when he was asked about China engagement in Africa, Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema had a different answer to give about China's presence in Africa. I'd like you to take a listen to what he had to say.
Let me just step aside a little bit and say things must not be seen that way. Things must not be seen that way. I totally agree with the Vice President that we're here to foster the U.S.-Zambia relationship. But there's a context in the sense that that relationship exists in the operating environment where other countries also exist. So, but the contextualization that if the U.S. and Zambia share a lot in common, strong bilateral relationship, historical relationship, then they are doing things against China. It's actually wrong, completely wrong. So I have said before, when I'm in Washington, I'm not against Beijing. Equally, when I'm in Beijing, I'm not against Washington. We have a globe we share. We have a planet we share, Earth. For us in Africa, we have our continent. It is easy to say when the president of Zambia is visiting Pretoria in South Africa, he's against Abuja and Nigeria. That's the logic. Not quite. What we expect of America and China as the two leading economies, number one, USA, number two, China, is to help us keep our world safe for everybody.
As you can see, Hakainde Hichilema make it quite clear. There's no context where China engagement with Zambia can be seen or interpreted as a move against the U.S. Just in the same context, Zambia engagement with Washington cannot be interpreted as a threat to China. And Zambia said it remains open to work with both Chinese and Americans, and there's no need to put a context where there is a zero-sum game where being with China, it means being against the U.S. and the West, and being with the West and U.S. is being against China. Africa actually wants the both of them because both of them are addressing different need and issue that African countries do have. When African countries need infrastructure, when they need financing for the infrastructure, they know where to go to. They go to the Chinese because the Chinese are willing to come and invest in places where many Western countries and government are not willing to say. And this is what Nigerian Vice President Yemi Osibanjo had to say last week Monday in King's College in London. Hear what he has to say about that.
Most African countries, as you can imagine, are, in my view, rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. China also shows up when the West will not or is reluctant to show up. And many African countries, of course, are of the view that the warnings about the Chinese Trojan loans may be wise, but are probably self-serving. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and the Chinese offer them. In any case, the history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere. And the preoccupation of Western governments and the media with the so-called China debt trap might well be an overreaction.
As you can hear, African countries are not sorry about the engagement and the relationship with China because they do know that China came in a moment where many in the West were really not willing to come into Africa. And as he said himself, many on the continent they didn't forget the structural adjustment, the difficult choices that many countries had to do just to get loan or to see their debt forgiven by the IMF and the World Bank. So when Western countries come with the China bashing narrative in Africa, it's very and quite unlikely that that narrative is going to make a difference among African decision makers, because as much as people on the ground can be worried about China influence, because let's face it, China engagement in Africa comes with its own issues, but those issues are not the one portrayed by many in the West when they come to criticizing China in Africa. And that's where we really need to be clear about that as African, that, China is coming in Africa. Yes, it came in a moment where many were not willing to come, but it did not come freely. It came with risk, and it came also with its own challenges. But you also be aware that when the West come with the narrative by saying that China is dangerous, we have to remember that, China was there and China is there when many were not willing to come in Africa. So in that context, we do know that there is no zero-sum game when it comes to China and US engagement on the continent. There are room for cooperation. And I'd like you to take a look on the poll here to see where China and the West and the US really engage with African country. When it comes to infrastructure, African country, they know they can go to China. They can find funding and financing from China. But when it comes to governance issues, they know they can go to Washington, they can go to London because of historical background, because of colonial history with those countries. Also because China does not engage in political issues in African country. We can see how China and the US and the Western country in general, they address different need and different issue of African leaders and African society in general in that situation. So when you take that into account, you kind of come to understand that there's no need to fight. There's no need to have Africa with China versus Europe and the West, Africa with the West against China. No, there's really room. There are rooms for cooperation. And it's really up to us as African civil society, NGO, African leaders to not play into the dividing narrative of we have to be with one against the other. As I say, it's not a zero-sum game. It's up to us to create the condition and the context for them to cooperate on the continent. Because on the longer run, I don't think we're going to have any interest of picking side. It's time for us to really engage with them for our own interest. And for our Western friends who are following me, people in Washington, in London, and I'd like to really keep on telling you, when you come to Africa, come and engage with African country for themselves, not for countering China, not because of China. Come and engage with African government for what they want and start to listen what African countries have to say about what they want in the global stage. So for you, our audience who've been following us, please leave your thought in the comments. Tell us, what do you think should be the next course of action? Where African countries should lean on? Do you think that we have to pick a side, or do you think that we have to be more responsible on how we want those countries to engage with us on the global stage? Please leave the comment, and we're going to have a great discussion about that. We're also going to have in the China Global South Project, we're going to have a podcast this week that's going to come out where we are going to talk about those issues with my colleagues, Cobus Van Staden and Eric Orlando. We are going to talk about those different issues, US, China, Africa, what's going to happen. We're going to talk about mining industry in Africa. So stay tuned in our podcast, China in the Global South. You're going to find it in different place where you find your podcast. So this is going to be it for me today in this video. It took a bit longer than I was expecting, but I think that the conversation was quite interesting. So keep on following us on our different websites in English, www.chinaglobalsouth.com, in French, projetafriquechine.com, and in Arabic. But sorry, I don't have the Arabic website, but you can find it by visiting our website, where you're going to see French, English, and Arabic. I'd like to thank you for your support and your dedication to our China Global South project. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to tell you, see you next week for another video of China in the Global South.